Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's my pleasure to rise to speak to the motion today. I think one of the things that I'll commend the sponsor of the motion for is for putting some concrete ideas on the table about how we can try and provide relief to Canadians who are living through very difficult economic times. And that's certainly something that has been a focus of the work of the NDP over the last number of years. I think, and I won't, belabor the history of our attempts to try and make sure that working people and vulnerable people in Canada have what they need in order to live a life of dignity. But it's certainly been a focus of ours through the pandemic. And that's why I think you've seen a real willingness on the part of New Democrats to come to this place, understanding that, we may not have liked the outcome of the election, but we respect what Canadians did in terms of building a parliament and having an expectation that parliamentarians will come here to work on behalf of Canadians and try and navigate the parliament that they elected and try and come to agreement on concrete policy ideas that are going to make a difference in the lives of Canadians. That doesn't mean that every idea that's put on the table will find agreement in this place, but I think we're doing our job well when we take those proposals seriously, when we make counter proposals in the event that we don't like the initial offering, and I think Canadians enjoy seeing their parliamentarians engaged in that kind of work. And there's no question that this is a difficult economic time. I had the opportunity yesterday to speak to some of the reasons why Canadians are having such a difficult time and why we're seeing, even in the face of sometimes good news announcements about the economy, why that isn't translating into financial security and economic security for so many Canadians who are worried about losing their jobs still in an economy that on the one hand needs more workers, and we hear there's a labor shortage, but for many Canadians they're living with pretty serious job insecurity. They're already either out of work, or they're working reduced hours, or they're concerned about the future of their industry. That's true for industries that have been affected by the pandemic. We think of the tourism industry and the travel industry, the entertainment industry, and other industries that are still reeling from the impacts of the pandemic and wondering what their industry looks like into the future. But it's also true because of climate change. And many Canadians who are seeing the impacts of climate, of extreme weather events, the impact on supply chains, and also understanding the need for the Canadian economy to become more sustainable if we're to prevent the worst scenarios of climate change. And I think Canadians, are right to wonder about their own individual place in that and the meaning of those changes for their families. And I think, and that's why I'll come back to my opening remarks, which is that I think it's incumbent upon us as their elected representatives in this place to work in good faith to try and find solutions and create a path that gives Canadians a better sense of certainty about where the economy is heading, so that they can plan better their individual futures and the futures of their families and their neighborhoods. So the question before us today is in light of rising prices, in light of this intense period of inflation that we've embarked upon, and what that means for Canadians who are struggling with income and job security and rising prices, what can we do to try and provide some relief? And of course, we've talked many times about longer term things that government ought to be doing. Certainly we need to see policy action in the housing market, and that's not something that's going to change overnight. It would be very hard to affect the affordability of housing overnight, but that doesn't mean there aren't things that we could be doing right now in order to put us on the path toward lowering the cost of housing. So that's certainly something that we think we need to see better action on. A key part of that is even just, and I mean, it's sad that we're so far away from effective housing policy in Canada, but one thing the government can and should be doing right now, and New Democrats are working hard to get the government to do, is even just to ensure that the public funds that we do spend on housing now to build affordable housing actually build affordable housing. And of course, the definition of affordability in the National Housing Strategy has been a barrier to that, because the way the Liberals initially chose to define housing affordability in their strategy has actually kept so-called affordable housing out of reach for far too many Canadians. And one thing that we could do is change that definition to make sure that the projects that are receiving public funds are projects that are in fact going to create housing that is truly affordable for those who find themselves in the greatest housing need. So that's something longer term that we could be doing. Childcare was something that the NDP ran on many times, and we're often told by Liberals that was unrealistic. Couldn't be done. There was so much jurisdictional negotiating to do, the provinces would never get behind it. It wasn't rolled to the federal government. Some Liberals may be nodding because they remember these lines from the 2015 campaign where they repeated them ad nauseum. They may remember them from the subsequent parliament where for 4 years in majority government they chose to repeat those lines rather than getting to work and doing something. What we found when they found the political will, after years of pressure from the NDP and from civil society and frankly just Canadian parents who knew better and needed the help, was that they were actually able to conclude those deals rather quickly. What's remaining is for them to cement that in legislation to make sure that those things can't be undone in the way that a Conservative government subsequently undid the Canada Health Accord arrangement. And I think to the shame of the Liberals, they chose to perpetuate that by not convening new rounds of negotiation on a Canada Health Accord, but instead going around and signing bilateral deals. So all that to say, are there things that government can be doing to create a context in 3, 5, or 10 years where some of the price pressure on Canadian households is reduced? Absolutely there is. Another important place where Canadian households are suffering is on dental care, because too many Canadians don't have coverage and they don't have the money to be able to pay for dental care. Someone was just telling me a story earlier today of their brother who had a decent job but didn't have dental care, had to move back in with his parents as an adult because the money he had to borrow in order to get his mouth fixed meant that he couldn't live independently anymore, and is going to have to remain living with his parents for some time until his financial situation improves. That's also something that government can work on right now to bring those costs down for Canadians into the future, next year and the year after. But there still is the question of whether government can do something that is going to have a truly immediate impact. And so that's the proposal that we find ourselves discussing today. In this case, the Conservatives have proposed lifting the GST off of the price of gas at the pump. So again, right on, we've got a concrete proposal. It's something that can provide immediate effect, but we do have to ask whether this is the right proposal and whether it's going to have all of the right consequences. And I would say, first of all, that I think part of the issue that I would have with this proposal is that it really prioritizes reducing the price simply on oil and gas. And that's only one of the issues that are confronting Canadians in this difficult time. And so, I think we want to try and find ways to provide financial relief for Canadians that aren't simply about putting more of an emphasis on oil and gas, when we know in the face of the climate crisis that we need to be trying to de-emphasize the role of oil and gas in our economy. And so that's one flag that goes up in respect of this proposal. Another flag that goes up, I think, from the point of view of equity is that while many Canadians rely on cars in order to get to and from work, to drop off their kids and pick them up from school, not all Canadians do that. There are other Canadians who aren't using a car, sometimes because they can't afford it, sometimes because they've made a choice to use other means of transportation, whether that's active transportation or public transportation. There are seniors who don't drive because their eyesight isn't up to it. They've had their licenses revoked, or they've made the decision themselves not to drive anymore. Those are people who are also experiencing these very real cost pressures. And so I think if we're going to come up with a solution to try and provide immediate financial relief, that it's important that we try and find something that can apply to as large a category of people as possible and that is sure to capture the most vulnerable. That's not to say it has to be limited to the most vulnerable, but it certainly ought to capture them. Or I think we have to look in the mirror and wonder if we're really getting that balance right, Mr. Speaker. So that's a very important consideration. And the other thing that I would say, Mr. Speaker, is that I do think that the emphasis simply on tax relief, while that is a mechanism, and I would like to propose an amendment near the end of my speech, Mr. Speaker, on this motion. The emphasis on tax relief can be appropriate sometimes, but I would be remiss if I didn't note that coming from the Conservatives, I do think that it's part of a larger project to always find a way to simply blame government, when we know that there's a lot of other things going on that are driving cost pressures. And we know also, I mean, look, high prices at the gas pump are not a new thing. Oil and gas companies have been finding ways and pretexts to raise the price at the pump for years. Sometimes they pertain to, in this case, a global crisis that's well outside the immediate control of the Canadian government, but sometimes a long weekend is good enough for them to jack up prices. And certainly seeing tax relief on the cost at the pump without any further guarantee that prices would remain low and that savings would be transferred to the consumer, I think does raise the question of whether or not oil and gas companies would simply see this as another reason to raise their own prices in order to capture that extra bit of revenue, instead of having it go back to consumers. So I think those are all reasons why, while I'm glad to see a proposal, like a real proposal, come out of the Conservative Party, I might hazard to say it's the first in this Parliament, we don't think it's quite on the mark, Mr. Speaker. What I do think might be on the mark, and still within the scope of this motion, because it's about providing tax relief on an energy product in the context of significant inflation, would be to rather see the lifting of the GST not at the price on the pump, but on home heating. Because that's something that applies to everyone. And while I respect that, you know, driving your car, whether it's for work or for other reasons, is well integrated into the lives of many Canadians. That's true for me at home as well, Mr. Speaker. There is a little bit more flexibility for people on how much they drive, how often they drive, than there is on whether they heat their home. So, you know, if you're living in Canada in the winter, you're going to be heating your home. It doesn't matter if you're a vulnerable senior who can no longer drive. It doesn't matter if you're somebody who has made the choice to use public transportation or active transportation. It doesn't matter if you're somebody who's using an electric car. You're going to be heating your home. And that's why I think if we're serious about trying to provide widespread relief to Canadians, if we're serious about ensuring that this isn't just another way to talk about oil and gas in Parliament because some people feel that makes the government feel uncomfortable, or it's you know, a nice thing to say to lobbyists when they come visit your office from the oil and gas industry, then I think having a proposal around home heating is a better way to go. Of course, this was something that was touted for a long time by Jack Layton, and as far as we're concerned, is a bit of unfinished business. There are a lot of other essential goods that the GST does not apply to, because we recognize that there are certain kinds of things that Canadians simply can't go without, and we think it's reasonable to withhold charging the GST on those things. And so I think this is another example when we talk about home heating of how that can be done. The other thing that I would add, and I'm going to speak from the Manitoba experience here. I'm not an expert on public utilities across Canada, but I do know that in the Manitoba context, if a public utility wants to raise rates, they have to go through a public process. They have to make submissions to the Public Utilities Board. They can't just wantonly raise their rates, unlike oil and gas companies at the pump. And so not only do I think that this is, when we talk about withholding the GST on home heating, not only do we have a tax relief measure that would apply more broadly across the board, but we also have better insurance that companies won't simply make up the difference and take that revenue for themselves while charging the consumer more, because at least in some parts of the country we know that the companies that might consider doing that would have to go through a process of public review in order to be able to raise their prices. So I think this proposal that I'm going to formally move shortly, Mr. Speaker, is better in that regard. So it's better in that it actually captures more people, and I think is more likely to provide real relief to some of Canada's most vulnerable, while also still providing meaningful relief to Canada's middle class, who are also really struggling through this time of inflation. It's a better proposal because I think we have more reason to expect that that tax relief won't simply be eaten up by companies raising their prices. And I think it's also a better proposal because it doesn't prejudice any one particular type of energy. There are people who heat their homes with renewable energy. There are people who heat their homes with electricity. There's different ways of heating your home. And so this isn't something that's focused specifically on oil and gas. And it's something that can continue to benefit Canadians as we transition towards a lower carbon economy. So it isn't a proposal that predicates tax relief upon the persistent use of fossil fuels. It recognizes that people are using fossil fuels to heat their homes. It provides tax relief to them anyway, but it doesn't build in oil and gas to the tax relief remedy. And I think that that's something that is important in the context of figuring out how Canada can provide meaningful help to Canadians in this difficult time, while continuing to honor our very real and important commitment to doing our part to ensure that climate change doesn't run away on us and cause even more hurt and turmoil and economic dislocation than it is already likely to do. So those are all the reasons why I'm glad to be having this debate in the House today. I've said before, New Democrats are here to work in a spirit of collaboration with anyone here prepared to work with us to do things that we believe are in the best interest of Canadians. That should come as no surprise to anyone, particularly on this day, where I think New Democrats have proven that we are prepared to work with people. We do that with eyes wide open. Our eyes would be similarly wide open in working with the Conservatives on improving this motion. But that's something that we're prepared to do. And we will continue to be prepared to work with anyone in this House that is prepared to work with us to make a difference in the lives of Canadians. That's what we're here to do. It's what Canadians expect of us. And it's not just what Canadians expect of New Democrats, it's what they expect of every member elected to this chamber. And it's in that spirit, Mr. Speaker, that I move, seconded by the member for Esquimalt-Saanich-Sooke, that the motion be amended by deleting all the words after the words provide relief and substituting the following. To Canadians, by removing the federal sales tax from the home heating bills of Canadian households. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
It's my duty to inform honourable members that an amendment to an opposition motion may only be moved with the consent of the sponsor of the motion, or in case that he or she is not present, consent may be given or denied by the House Leader, the Deputy House Leader, the Whip, or the Deputy Whip of the sponsor's party. Since the sponsor is not present in the chamber, I ask the Whip if he or she consents to this amendment being moved. The honourable member for Red Deer Lacombe.
Mr. Speaker, it's odd that the NDP Liberal government member would want to take over an Opposition Day motion, so there is no consent.
There is no... There is no consent, therefore, pursuant to Standing Order 85, the amendment cannot be moved at this time. So we'll go back into questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Drummond.
The honourable member for Drummond. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. And I'd like to share my empathy for the fact that he hasn't been able to table his amendment. But I'd like to speak about that amendment. I was a bit surprised to hear our NDP colleague propose an amendment which, instead of trying to encourage people to transition to green energy, is instead encouraging people to continue consuming fossil fuel products. I use electricity for heating at home, and I think many Quebecers and Canadians who are trying to transition are doing. I would have expected from our colleague an amendment to the motion that would have instead proposed incentives to encourage people to transition to residential heating systems that are more ecological, instead of once more encouraging us to use oil and gas products more. And in addition, one of the criticisms of the Conservative motion is that the tax or the financial burden will be passed on to consumers instead of oil companies. So I'd like to hear from my colleague on these points. The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona. Well, I think one of the good things about my suggestion was that it can apply to any heating method, including electricity, electrical heating. And so the intention was not to favor oil and gas as a method of heating. I agree with my colleague that it's important to encourage people to transition, but we recognize that that can't happen overnight. And people are facing problems with their costs right now. So we see this measure as a way to help people at this time, during this difficult time. But we do definitely need to make the transition. And we need to do so in a way that doesn't encourage people to use oil and gas. And I think that my amendment was doing that, indeed.
Questions and comments. L'honorable député de Halifax West.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. J'ai une question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Listened intently to what he said, and there's a number of items that, we agree with. We were all elected to this place of parliament here in order to represent our constituents and to work collaboratively, to work in partnership, to make lives better for Canadians. But as we all know, revenue comes to government from so many different sources. In order for government, government does need revenue to provide support for seniors, for families, for people of different abilities, to continue the great programs of early childhood education and all of the ones. Can you please comment on increasing sources of revenue, and how can government work better in that in order to be able to provide Canadians with the affordable housing and all the services that they deserve? Thank you.
Well, I can't comment on it, but I'll ask the member for Elmwood-Transcona to respond to it.
Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you. I'm very happy to comment on your behalf, of course. Look, I would refer the honourable member to our Opposition Day motion yesterday, where we proposed a 3% surcharge tax on industries that have done very well in the pandemic, whether it's big banks, box stores, oil and gas companies that are the beneficiaries actually of these incredible increases at the pump. And so those are some of our, that's just one proposal that we managed to table yesterday. But of course there are many things we think that the Liberal government ought to be doing on the question of tax fairness. We ran on a wealth tax. I think that's actually a far more fair way to raise revenue rather than asking the middle class, who are already struggling, to pay more in tax to fund these things. And that's another way that I think we can fund something like a temporary relief on home heating of the GST. I think that we should be working to close the agreements that we have about tax havens that the PBO has said we're losing $25 billion a year in revenue on. I think beyond the 3% surtax that was proposed yesterday, we need to be looking at an excess profit tax for those companies in the pandemic that did extraordinarily well on top of their normal healthy earnings and profit. So yes, absolutely. There are a lot of ways that we could be raising revenue in Canada. There are other jurisdictions that have shown far more leadership on this, both in terms of closing tax loopholes and ensuring that the wealthy pay their fair share. I think it's high time we did that, and we're going to continue to be a voice pressuring the government to do those things in the months and years ahead.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Elgin, Middlesex, London.
Thank you very much, and I do appreciate the amendment that the member wanted to put forward, but I want to really focus on what we are doing today. In his comments, he mentioned, you know, seniors don't drive. There's a variety of different reasons why this doesn't impact each and every Canadian, but I would like to fully disagree with him on that, because we recognize those things coming into the stores. Many things are some GST exempt, but there is fuel on that gasoline when we're doing shipments. When a person's being driven to a medical appointment, maybe it's a taxi. There's going to be an increase right there. There's that 5% sitting there in taxes. There are so many ways that we can look at this. So although it's not cut and dry because it's not a direct link, we know that overall it will have a bearing. When there's a reduction of 5%, it will reduce the costs of things for people because gas is being used in this, or fuel. So my question to the member is, will he be supporting this bill?
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, as I said, I mean, we're here to try and cooperate and negotiate, but of course it takes two to tango, I think is the phrase, Mr. Speaker. And I think we heard a pretty clear message from the whip that he's not in the mood to dance on behalf of the Conservative Party, and so that's difficult. I don't think that precludes us cooperating in the future on other things, but I think we were clear that we wanted, if we were going to go the route of tax relief, we wanted something that would apply more broadly than simply providing tax relief at the pump, that we wanted something that didn't have its principal focus being on oil and gas into the future, and we wanted something where there was a better sense of certainty that the companies that could raise prices in order to eat up that price differential of the lower taxes wouldn't be able to do so, and that's why we felt that home heating was a superior choice as well, because there are usually public processes for rate increases on public utilities that don't exist for oil and gas companies at the pump.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for London Fanshawe.
Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for his speech and his contribution today and his attempts to make this motion a bit better. Unfortunately, it did not turn out that way. So yesterday I was in this House and I was listening to the Conservative members discuss our Opposition Day motion. And they were talking about the need for actually, on the big corporations that we were insisting that there needed to be increases in terms of tax measures, that in fact these big corporations needed tax decreases, that their profit margins weren't really that large. And so and I know that this is difficult for him to try and get into a Conservative mind state maybe, but perhaps he could try to explain why they are so resolute about not moving in the way, in terms of that progressive taxation, and why they are so convinced that you cannot tax big corporations on those excessive profits. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, thank you very much for that question, and indeed I do often struggle to put myself in the mindset of my Conservative colleagues. To be charitable, I might hazard this attempt. I would say this, that I think too often Conservatives have a tendency, in fact a deep kind of driving need, to blame every problem on the government. And while government can certainly sometimes be the problem, I mean, I believe that. It's why I bothered to get elected, and why and why we work so hard in this place to change the disposition of government and to influence government's actions, because government certainly does have a role to play. But there are other actors in the world that have real power that also contribute to some of the problems that Canadians are facing. And so I think the Conservatives sometimes, because they're so narrowly focused on the problems of government and trying to blame every problem on the government, sometimes miss the fact that they become apologists for everybody else. Because to admit that there might be a problem somewhere that isn't in the halls of government kind of undermines their entire intellectual political framework. And so it's a difficult thing for them to focus on. And that's why I think sometimes they might end up apologizing for large companies that are doing very well, thank you, and are themselves part of the problem that are facing Canadians.
Reprise du débat, continuing debate. The honourable member for Northumberland, Peterborough South. Oh, the honourable member for Calgary, Midnapore.
Thank you so much. Didn't just insult our entire constituencies and those who voted for us when he made reference to the intellectual framework of our party. We are all elected here in this House, and it's very disappointing to hear any type of reference to intelligence of either us or our members or those who voted for us, Mr. Speaker. So I'm going to give the member an opportunity to apologize for that, because that was uncalled for, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the member just answered her own question when we were talking about the intellectual capacity of the Conservative caucus, because they did not hear anything in there that said anything about ordinary voters. We were talking about the Conservatives and particularly their backbench.
The honourable for Elmwood Transcona first, and then maybe I'll get back to Calgary.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I do appreciate the opportunity to respond. Two things to say. One, I would note that a comment about the intellectual framework of a political organization is not a comment about people's intelligence. First of all, those are just two separate things. But second of all, I would say that pointing out the shortcomings of certain elected representatives says nothing of the voters. I mean, voters elect people in good faith. People don't always live up to the expectations of voters. Pointing out that may be the case is no insult to the voter. Might be an insult, but it's not an insult to the voter, Mr. Speaker.
All right, we're still on the point of order. The member for Brantford-Brant.
Yes, on the point of order, Mr. Speaker, I took great offense to the member who now questioned the intellectual capacity of the Conservative backbench. I'm a proud member of the Conservative backbench, and to the member who questioned my intellectual capacity, I've enjoyed a 30-year legal career. I've got a BA Honours Political Science, Mr. Speaker. I've got a law degree. I've had a distinguished career as a public servant for the Ontario government, and now I'm a proud member of the Conservative Party. Thank you.
Now, we are starting to descend, we are descending a little bit into debate. The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Well, I was fascinating to see him read his resume, but I'm not really sure what the point was. It's nice to hear from the member of the backbench once in 6 months with his resume, but was there a question pointed at me? I didn't hear anything.
All right, we've descended far too far. I've let this go far too long.